Hi, Frederick. We met in person in the last 2-3 months because you came to the Middle East, you came to Oman to do your postdoctoral studies. Can you tell us more about your new project?
Sure, thanks very much for having me back. Great to talk as always. Yeah, so my current project, which I've just started, is looking at perceptions of water scarcity in Jordan, and also the social and economic effects. So this is a department, a bit of a departure for me. I'm an economic anthropologist, economic and political anthropologist, and previously I was looking at contemporary manifestations of tribal politics and connecting it to colonial history in Jordan and the wider Middle East. However, at the time, I became quite interested in some talk in some rural areas around water scarcity and ideas of environmental sovereignty over water resources. And so this got me interested in this project. And it's not only me. I think water and water scarcity, it's become a sustainable development goal. And it's probably the second biggest issue after the refugee crisis in terms of research and development attention and initiatives in Jordan. And unlike the refugee crisis, which is probably a sort of declining sector in a sense, whether it should be or not is another matter, water is a huge growing area. There's so many new water initiatives, institutes, fora, consultants working out of Amman. I mean, it's becoming a huge industry and a huge sector, and you know it's becoming one of the most well-known facts about Jordan, that it's one of the most water scarce countries in the world. However, what I'm interested in is what these kind of discourses leave out. So most of this discourse around Jordan being one of the most water poor countries in the world gets tied to two things. It gets tied to climate change, and it gets tied to water scarcity, environmental determinism. It's sort of built into the region, as it were. I'm interested in trying to explore the everyday hydropolitics of water in Jordan. So the sort of small political and political economic aspects of people's relationship with water. When we get into the kind of hydropolitical side, there's also a dominant discourse, which is, I think, encouraged by the Jordanian government, which is that everything is to be blamed on water diplomacy, foreign relations, particularly with, around the Yarmouk and the Jordan River. I think one of the facts which is unavoidable, though, and everyone has to come to terms with eventually, and there's different ways of doing so, is that management has a huge role in this, and there's various sort of technical or socio-technical ways of looking at water management. But what is pretty much universally agreed upon is that roughly half the water supply in Jordan is non-revenue water, as in it goes missing between the point where it's where it sort of enters the system and where it gets to its end user. There's various ways this is calculated. If we look at sort of metering by the 3 private water companies, if we look at estimates of usage against wastage, there's various ways of calculating it, but either way, this is a huge problem. And within that, it's also pretty much indisputed that a very sizable part of that, probably as much as half, is through water theft. And then, again, we can't just take that term as read. We have to kind of interrogate it a bit and find out what water theft actually means. What does it look like? How do people justify practices which involve subverting the official water network? So it's I think a very interesting and important case. The water sector in Jordan is very highly studied in a sense. As I said, it's got this huge focus for development organizations, for the World Bank, for UNICEF as well. I've just brought out a big report. And yet at the same time, the underlying data from the underlying data and the underlying reality is not especially amenable to technocratic solutions, because so much of it is outside of the gaze of the state, as it were. The state doesn't really have a handle on where this water is going or on why people are choosing to steal it. There's kind of this official water system, which is kind of very much considered as a matter for engineers and technocrats to control, and is amenable to technical knowledge and to the use of data. And then there's this enormous shadow economy for water, we might say, which is much harder to understand and to measure. And the social factors, the social and economic factors that are influencing it, are much harder to shed light on. I think Samir Taluzi, who's a Jordanian scholar, has a very useful phrase in this. He calls water a techno-social assemblage, and I think this kind of gets at this problem, that sort of technical and engineering approaches to the water sector are useless without a really deep understanding of the sort of socioeconomics of water in people's daily lives. So that's the sort of theoretical background. In practical terms, the way my research works, this is still very early days for it. This is kind of pilot study at the moment. I've just done 3 months in Jordan. Is firstly a series, I've been interviewing and conducting sort of semi-structured interviews and participant observation at the offices of various water NGOs and water policymakers and water experts in and around Amman. I've been doing kind of deep dive into the social life of water through a domestic water user survey, which I've been conducting with the help of an excellent research assistant, Suhail Khatib, who's a master's student at the German Jordanian University. And that has been, I've got case studies there in New Zarqa, Jebel al-Nadif, which is a poor area in East Amman, and Khalda, a sort of richer West Ammani area where water consumption is quite high. And then I've got a rural case study looking at the Werle River Valley and its agricultural station and its dam, and rural livelihoods sort of around that area. I also am doing some work with farmers in the Ruhr, but that's a kind of slightly separate issue because the water, the Jordan Valley Authority has its own kind of water system, although some of the issues are still very much the same. In all of this, kind of one of my key themes and key research aims is to try and understand the sort of social dynamics of water. So how do people react to the idea of water scarcity? What is their own perception of water scarcity in daily life? How is it impacting people? But also, how do people think about water theft or subverting the water system? And equally, how do people think about the equitability of water distribution between sectors and between different areas in Jordan? Which is, there are huge differences in supply, even within the capital. Some people are getting more than 24 hours of water, piped water in a week. Others sort of less than 12. And outside of Amman, the differences are even more striking. In some rural areas, people are getting 1 to 2 hours a week, sometimes in the middle of the night. So there are very, very interesting issues involved. Another growing interest of mine is how this links up with kind of wider discourses around corruption, because many of the people I've interviewed and talked to, especially normal people, kind of linked the problems with water and the question of missing water with a wider sense of a prevailing crisis of corruption within Jordan. And we're not just talking about high-level corruption, we're talking almost about an idea of corruption being implicit at every level of the system. This is kind of interesting to me because the anthropology of corruption and sort of economic anthropologists who've worked on corruption have kind of studied how these discourses of corruption take on a life of their own, which are often quite separate from reality. A guy called Jonathan Parry did some research in India, which showed that the prevalence of people's sense of the efficacy of corruption was much higher than the natural reality. People thought you could do a lot more via corruption, and that corruption was much more widespread than it seems to have been. But the fact that people believe this has certain important socioeconomic consequences, one of which, arguably, I would suggest, is that if you believe the system to be kind of corrupt, broken, and unfair, trying to rip it off or subvert it for your own uses, say by tapping a standpipe or getting some water on the cheap somehow, comes to look less like sort of something deeply immoral or like theft, really. So water has some interesting properties there to think through. I also think, finally, and then I'll let you get some questions in, that it's interesting to consider how water, particularly when people kind of think about it in general terms and sort of in regional terms, kind of is a way of talking about broader ideas of political economy. So, for instance, in the area around the Werle River Valley, you have a relatively restive and disadvantaged set of communities, places like Diban, Lih, and the villages up in Jabal Bani Hamida, which have at various points been associated with anti-government protests as well. One thing that comes out of this a lot is an idea that the lack of equitability in water kind of reflects a broader political economic relationship between that area and the capital. So that as water becomes more scarce, partly, the Werle River Dam is used to provide water to the capital. It's not just used for local irrigation. People say our land is being bled, or they're bleeding us, which I think is an interesting phrase which describes a wider relationship than just water. But water makes it very concrete for people. It's people can say, we get less water than people, half an hour's drive up the road. Why is this fair? Why is this fair? And also, this is an area where agriculture is one of the only sort of economic activities open to a lot of people, right? There isn't a lot of industry, and state employment, which has also been important, is largely in decline. There's less jobs for people, less government jobs for people. So you end up at the situation there where people have kind of maybe over romanticized a kind of a past where sort of subsistence on the land was possible. Obviously, it's not with modern populations, and even less with modern agricultural techniques, which are much more water intensive. But from the point of view of various people there, people in the the broader Hamaida tribe, there's a kind of a long history to this, right? That they were sort of encouraged to settle and to become sort of modern citizens of a nation state, and to adopt settled life and the economic activities and services that come with that. And part of their ability to do so rested on a bargain with the state that in return they'd receive services including irrigation and subsidized animal feed for their flocks, etc., etc. It was Wasfi Atel who really kind of made this moral economy with the Bedouin, I guess, more broadly, right? And it was him that established the agricultural stations in the 60s in these places to kind of encourage new agricultural education and techniques. And actually, the one in Werle is one of the last of them. Most of them have gone. And then when these get sort of underfunded, or when the water dries up, obviously, and agriculture becomes much more difficult, people become quite angry. And then, especially when it seems like certain large cash crop agricultural initiatives, I won't pass on hearsay and rumors, but owned by people with, perhaps we might say, a lot of wasta, never seem to be short of water, right? This is a big issue, and people have also, there's a lot of conspiratorial talk about corruption around water. It's hard to know how true a lot of it is, and how accurate it is. I think it is safe to say that a lot of this stuff does go on. People do find ways of getting water, and the more politically well connected they are, and the richer they are, the easier it is. I think it's also undeniable that certain people in certain areas of the country have become very lucky in that they're in areas which for geographical and political reasons, are lightly policed, and they have a history of kind of being considered people the state has to treat with care. I'm thinking certain people south of Amman in tribal Bedouin areas. And they have used this kind of status, this kind of political status, which is what was one of the things I explored in my last research, my doctoral research, to make a killing really out of stealing water and digging illegal wells. So you have a series of levels at which this sort of abuse is taking place in a way, if you want. I mean, abuse kind of loads it with moral terminology, but these kind of practices take place. It goes right from the level of people in poor areas of Amman deciding to try and tap the pipe before it gets to their meter, because particularly when water supply is unreliable in summer months. Right the way up to then, enormous sort of quasi-infrastructural projects where people have dug very large tunnels near the airport to tap the main pipeline carrying water from the DC project in the south, which is groundwater from Jordan up to the capital. And in between that, you have people very professionally sinking illegal wells for the last few decades. And there's been various attempts to crack down on this, but there are problems with these crackdowns too, because they often risk upsetting poor rural communities who, if they only got the water that they're officially kind of rationed, a lot of agricultural people employed currently in agriculture would be unemployed, and that has a political consequence, right? It increases rural unrest, and because of this, the Ministry of Water maybe is sometimes, I've found, in tension with the Ministry of the Interior, who have their own agenda and don't want to kind of rock the boat too much. So that is kind of an overview, I suppose, of where we are. One last thing I'll say, and then I will shut up, is that
no, just continue. I'm listening to you, and I have more questions and some comments.
Okay, great. One of the big questions that keeps coming up in a lot of this is, why do people steal water? What are the social consequences? And one thing that's come out of my interviews with people, both in the domestic sector, but also in the agricultural sector, is the problem isn't the cost of water, which is generally low. It's fundamentally supply, right, and reliability of supply, particularly in the summer months when people can't even be sure that they'll get their normal ration slot when the pipes are turned on, right? Most people last summer experienced delays with their weekly supply or reduced hours. That was very common in the capital. I don't know whether you did, but I think a lot of people
No, for
did.
me, I can't complain. I have a tank of 2 cubic meters on the rooftop and 2 cubic meters in the basement in the basement.
Yeah.
And very rarely I had to use the engine to fill the water tank on my rooftop. It fills automatically by pressure, and I didn't experience any water shortages in the last 2-3 years, more than 3 years. The only problem I faced was when the water pipe burst in the basement, and I had to pay 265 dinars for 3 months, which was atrociously expensive, because normally I pay 7 dinars for 3 months.
Yes.
I knew that something went wrong because the landlady didn't check water tanks in the basement. In the meantime, I replaced the water pipes, and I replaced the fault on the rooftop in that water tank, so I don't have any leakage from my water tanks and pipes, and it's all back. But the problem with Mayahuna, lots of people complain about Mayahuna, which is a water authority, is that they tend to build bills, they tend to treat people with different bills, they tend to come out with the new bills after 10 years for instance, if you left an apartment in different part of Amman and you didn't cancel your registration, you may get surprised, and the new bill under your name after 15 years, which might be a few thousand dinars. And this is what can happen to people. But
so you obviously, as a
yeah.
single as a single guy in a flat, your
Exactly.
usage 7 JD per 3 months is
no, 7 dinars is very, very
so
affordable.
Average water bill, 3-monthly water bill was around I think around 30 to 35. I can't remember the exact figure, but it was around that per 3 month per quarter. Obviously it's moving.
Who's paying 35?
This was apparently the average. I think this figure also includes the wastewater fee as well, right? Which is relatively which interestingly seems to be, this is another thing I found out, that people are finding that even people in Mayahuna includes most of Madaba Governorate, and even people in rural areas who aren't connected to the sewage system find that they're being charged a bill for their waste, even though they're using their own septic tanks, which is another kind of issue around, as you say, people don't feel the bills are particularly fair, and often the pricing is quite untransparent. And obviously your usage is probably a lot lower than people, particularly people who have sort of 2 adults, sometimes more, and then 5 kids, say, and are doing washing and cooking for all of those on a regular basis. The usage can be much higher. But yeah, I think one of the other things that comes up more and more is so security of supply it seems to be a driver. But for instance, if people have a few trees, say like olive trees or fruit trees or nut trees or whatever, which they're irrigating, it often seems to be these kind of arrangements sort of somewhere between domestic and agriculture, where people feel it's worth their while to try and subvert the water system in some way. You've also kind of got this situation. So I would say, actually, I've got the figures here. Out of on my domestic survey, I mean, it varied a lot by region, but on average, about a third of people reported to having used tanker services at some point, right, when their own storage tanks are running low and they decide to order in a tanker. Now, there's some quite interesting calculations done by again by Summer Talosian. He worked with a team from the University of Stanford on this, which show that the water, there's a huge gap in essence between the water officially drawn by private tankers from registered metered wells, and the amount of water that is estimated that is actually purchased by people. If you look at kind of how much water people are buying from tankers, and you can do this in various ways. I think he did it by basically surveying tanker companies and also surveying customers. He got to a figure that the numbers would be about 3 times higher, right? This has been published. There's a sort of a journal article on this, but I mean, this kind of shows you that even in the tanker system, there's no firm divide between what we might call the kind of shadow economy of water and the main official water economy, right? There's sort of seepage between the two, as it were. Water is clearly coming into the water tanker system from the kind of the shadow water network. I think another really interesting case, which kind of blurs the line between corruption or water theft and kind of accidental seepage. I mean, that's another thing worth saying. Every country has a large non-revenue water component. I think the global average is estimated to be about 34%. In Britain, it's about 19%. Well, in England and Wales, anyway, and most of that is just seepage here. So this isn't unique to Jordan, but having over 50%, which is I think Miahunna's rate, and I think it's possibly even higher in the north, where the area under the Yarmouk Water Company, is unusual. But you know, one thing that came up a lot is that there was a huge initiative in 2020 with EU funding to renew the water network, and to specifically aimed with EU and US aid funding, I think, to basically seriously reduce non-revenue water through seepage, so leakage, so putting in new, much more efficient water infrastructure. And, you know, we're all familiar wandering around, particularly older neighborhoods of Amman. There's rusting pipes, there's leaking onto the road everywhere, right? It's very common. So a lot of money was spent on renewing this network. Interestingly, this had almost no effect on non-revenue water. One of the big reasons for this seems to have been that in large areas of East Amman, the old network wasn't properly decommissioned, right? It was either very crudely blocked off, or literally just taps were put into it and turned off. And then it was rerouted into a new system. And it didn't take long for people, especially in Zarqa, where a lot of people have a little bit of agricultural land as well, to realize that they could turn on these taps and water would go into the old system still. And I think some people made this as an honest mistake. For other people, I think it rapidly became clear that this water was unmetered. So often they would still pay their full normal monthly bill to Miahunna for water that they'd use for filling their storage tanks and for washing, etc. But if they wanted to do anything water intensive, like irrigate their gardens or wash their car, if they had one, you know, this sort of thing, they found out they had this other unmetered source, right, which was pretty useful. So this is, and you know, so by not decommissioning the old system, actually investing in better infrastructure, which seemed a good technocratic solution to non-revenue water, you know, they in some ways made the problem worse. They created a new way by which people were gaining access to water, right? And the whole system obviously is, while it gets kind of a lot of money for capex, you know, people are often, you know, development organizations are often happy to spend a lot for sort of a big project, paying for kind of less high impact stuff, which is deeply essential, like the upkeep of infrastructure, is really, really hard. And water tariffs are quite low in Jordan. I know it's difficult because, you know, the cost of living is increasing everywhere. The other thing with this, of course, is that water is very, very closely tied to energy, and particularly in Jordan, where surface water and rainwater are sort of decreasing part of the puzzle, as it were, part of Jordan's overall water budget, and more reliance, you know, about 60% now is coming from groundwater sources. And the energy costs of this are, you know, staggering. I mean, it's becoming one of the biggest, it probably is actually by now, I think, the biggest single use of electricity in Jordan is moving water about the place. And when you imagine sort of the Red Dead project, which is one of the kind of mega projects designed
you're talking about Dead Sea conveyor.
Yeah, the national carrier project.
And this is
the energy cost is unbelievable. Yes. And so this is another thing. I think you can't separate water and energy. You know, water, food, and energy. You know, this has been kind of talked about a lot in geography and the social sciences for a while. It kind of form a nexus, and it's you can't sort of do something with one sector without affecting the others.
They're talking about that sea conveyor for many years. Another plan was to connect Red Sea with Mediterranean through Israel. The problem is that
blue-green deal. Yes,
the water level in the Dead Sea is shrinking for more than 100 years. Mm-hmm. And also 45% of water resources in Jordan are transboundary, which is water shared by 2 or more states. So there are issues between Turkey, Syria, and Jordan, Israel and Jordan, Syria and Jordan, and water is very politicized topic in our region because of water scarcity. Do you think that Jordan is the most water scarce country in the world, or one of the most water scarce states in the world?
It's a really interesting question, and it depends a lot by how you calculate this. Obviously, Jordan has, as I said, a lot of attention is paid to Jordan's water sector, and therefore a lot of figures get generated. How useful these figures are is less clear. Certainly, if you look at Jordan's current water budget, like in absolute terms by the UN edition, Jordan is definitely one of the most water scarce. Probably, I think this figure generally agreed on is second or third most water scarce. I mean, we're talking about under 100 cubic meters per person per year, while the UN regards anything as under 500 per year as absolute water scarcity. So this is undeniable. At the same time, Jordan isn't an especially water efficient country in many ways, right? Water tariffs are still pretty low in Jordan. People use water in all sorts of ways that perhaps don't make so much sense in this kind of in an environment of an economics of scarcity. But it's very difficult to change. Around 60, slightly below 60 now, I think, % of Jordan's water goes on agriculture, even though it only contributes officially quite a small, about 5% of GDP. I think this underlooks, probably it's a huge underestimation, really, because there's so many fields that are kind of agriculture adjacent, producing agriculture equipment, people moving goods around, selling domestic agricultural produce. And of course, agriculture is a source of employment in areas with very few alternatives, like in the Ruhr. But yeah, definitely at the same time, and particularly when you consider the huge non-revenue water question, this kind of shadow economy of water, Jordan perhaps doesn't always the sort of rhetoric of water scarcity and the kind of experienced reality are often a little bit different. I mean, many people are experiencing really bad water scarcity right now, particularly farmers, upland farmers in Jordan. People are already making decisions that they can't afford to keep trees, or they need to reduce their flocks. People are making decisions that they, I've worked with a livelihoods initiative looking at using local wool to make relatively traditional woven products mostly for tourists, and that's become increasingly impossible because you need so much water to wash the wool. So I mean, this is something people are experiencing, but at the same time, many people's experiences, like you were saying, they maybe have had 1 or 2 summers where the water situation got a bit dicey for a few weeks, but on the whole, water is relatively affordable. They're able to meet their water needs. And in many cases, they're still able to do relatively water intense things like, irrigate gardens and wash cars, even fill up swimming pools. And when you look at how the tourist sector is using water, I mean, it's incredibly water intensive, right? It brings in a relatively high amount of GDP per cubic meter of water used, to look at it in kind of water accountancy terms, particularly compared to agriculture. But at the same time, it's unbelievably intensive. And actually, a lot of the tourist businesses in Amman are using private tankers as their main supply of water, which has its own impact. I mean, one thing you can see even is the difference between the water going into the Samra waste treatment center and the official amount of water that you would expect to go into it from sort of Mir Hunna's records. There's a lot more going in, and this shows you that again, it's a way of seeing that the amount of water entering the system via the private tankers is much higher than official estimates. Official estimates put it at about 6 million cubic meters. It's probably at least 3 times that, right?
One of the problems is a high birth rate, because in 1962, both banks had approximately 800,000 people.
Mm.
And now we're talking about 15 million people living in the East Bank and West Bank.
Mm.
So that extreme birth rate and influx of people from other regions directly affected the use of water.
Of
And
course, I
because
mean,
of
this is a huge factor, but
it
I think
is a
it's
huge
important.
factor.
I think it's important to be clear about what's driving it. Um, it's very easy to kind of blame everything on demography and just say, oh, this huge demographic expansion happened, and
Yeah,
ultimately most of Jordan's problems can be kind of taken back to there's too many people trying to live in an area which naturally wouldn't support this kind of population. But that isn't a neutral, apolitical fact, right? Natural demographic growth. There are estimates. People have looked into this. That they it's very hard to do, and I think you have to take it with a pinch of salt. But people sort of say that Jordan would have naturally been 2 to 4 million people, right?
yeah,
Rather than 11 to 14 million,
true.
depending on how you count the refugees. So the majority of that huge demographic expansion, really unparalleled. Very few countries went through such an extreme population growth over the last 100 years. Most
Most
of
of
it is
countries,
driven.
listen, most of countries that went through this type of demographic expansion came from this region, whether we're talking about Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, or Saudi Arabia. If you
But
look at figures, yeah.
Jordan is still exceptional. Its rate of growth is faster than Egypt, or has been over if you look since 1920, and that isn't driven by natural birth rates. That's largely driven by forced migration, right?
True.
I mean,
True.
we're really talking about millions and millions of people have been displaced and have been placed in a very water scarce area. This is a kind of a facet of political economy rather than a facet of natural birth rates, or a kind of a necessary part of kind of the global increase of population due to modernity, right? And it's a political problem in many ways, rather than a merely sort of demographic one. Obviously, all demographics is always political. But, the West Bank has, with its own with its own problems, did have more water and supported a larger population. And Israel's settler colonial project in the West Bank and mass displacement of Palestinians onto the East Bank has, in many ways created this situation. And it's also about how this demographic change has been managed, though, right? I mean, Jordan has tended to generalize at a very high level, the government in Jordan has tended to prioritize social cohesion and avoiding kind of avoiding unrest. And sometimes that involves playing off different sectors of the population against each other. Sometimes it involves turning a blind eye to practices which perhaps don't make so much sense, sort of long term and strategically. One of the big facets of this demographic shift and the huge arrival of refugees, particularly Palestinian refugees, in sort of, particularly post 67, was the explosion of. Okay.
So what I started talking about is not only a demographic explosion that occurs in the Arab world, but industries that are related to water, industries that are related to Dead Sea terrain, affect the level of the lake, because approximately 1/3 of the Dead Sea has shrunk over the past 5 decades. and the retreating waters have left underground cavities that periodically cause the roads, trucks, and buildings to collapse. We're talking about sinkholes, and the treacherous terrain has not deterred visitors from abroad and from Jordan to arrive and enjoy the Dead Sea, but sinkholes and the change of the level of the water affect the agriculture in that area, because Dead Sea is an agricultural area. Dead Sea and the Jordan River Valley are the breadbasket of the local agriculture.
They've become
yes. Did you talk to Dr. Hussam Hussein?
I certainly did. Yes. Yeah. Both in Jordan and before when he was in the UK. Yes.
True.
Yeah.
True.
Yes.
He studied at your university.
He did. He's his research on looks at kind of, again, discourses of hydropolitics, which is very interesting. And he particularly looked actually at the illegal well campaign under former Hazem al-Nasser, the former water minister in the sort of from 2013 to 2018. And yeah, I've spoken quite often with Hussam, and also have interviewed many of the same people. So yeah, there's a lot of overlap. I'm very, very grateful to Hussam, and have kind of made a lot of use of his research as well.
Yes.
But, what you were saying about the Dead Sea and agriculture in the war, yeah, I think it's really interesting, and it's become a kind of a cash crop area with some agribusiness as well as sort of small scale family farming. And yeah, particularly in Ghor Surfi, the decrease of the decreasing level of the Dead Sea, sinkholes, and increasing salination has devastating consequences. The interesting thing is, of course, like historically, while always there was a lot of agriculture in the Ghor and always some cash crops in the Ghor, as you know from some of your other guests, it was a center of Mamluk sugarcane production.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the center for subsistence agriculture, and particularly wheat, was up in the highlands, right, on particularly the Madaba plain and in the Balka. There was a lot of wheat grown, and this is something which has really disappeared since the sort of 50s and 60s. It went into decline and has just continued. One thing with this sort of demographic expansion as well is that it's not just about numbers, it's about where you put them. And this wasn't particularly planned, right? And one of the consequences is that some of the most fertile and most well naturally rain-fed land for farming in Jordan, outside the Ghor, was built over for residential purposes, often originally in an unplanned way, right? And later on, these sort of squatter settlements and refugee camps, which slowly became permanent and eventually became suburbs, or people took advantage of the fact that the refugee crisis in the past had created an uplift in the value of land for construction to sell off agricultural land to be built on. So places like Wadi Asir, which are now very densely packed residential area, suburb of the capital, was kind of another kind of mini breadbasket, or rather kind of fruit basket, and lots of other areas which were once given over to grain cultivation are now built over, right? And the other thing with that as well is that as less rainfall gets to percolate into the soil in areas of the highlands where there is decent rainfall because of construction, it does also have a knock-on effect of increasing evaporation and decreasing the recharge of aquifers, both kind of shallow and the deeper aquifers. And as groundwater wells get deeper and deeper, there's also a problem with increased salination, which in some areas is as much of a problem as supply. Even down in the Ruhr, people use relatively shallow surface wells, as well as using water from the King Abdullah Canal, which is, you know, the water that would have once gone down the Jordan River. Most of it now goes into irrigation canals on both sides of the border. But you know, they're also using shallow well water, and that is increasingly salty, which changes what you can grow, right? I mean, we're seeing the expansion of dates, and one of the reasons for that isn't just about profitability; it's to do with surviving higher temperatures and more salty water. But you know, dates aren't suitable everywhere. Even in the northern Ruhr, they struggle, and farmers don't necessarily have the training or the income to carry out sort of mitigation exercises or adaptation exercises. You know, particularly if you've invested a lot in mature trees, say orange trees. You know, you can't easily shift variety according to sort of new progress in agricultural science or new advice coming from NGOs around more drought resistant or salt resistant crops. So there are a lot of organizations working in this space who provide, you know, excellent free advice to farmers and training. There is some funding available as well, but there's still a huge gap really of farmers who A, don't know how, and B, probably can't adequately adapt to new kind of water and environmental realities.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I
don't know whether you.
Yeah, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask if you have any questions. Yeah.
Of course, I have questions. How the land distribution in Jordan is a political question, because lots of researchers think that agricultural reforms and particularly agricultural reforms after the establishment of Emirates of Jordan and after collapse of the Ottoman Empire were very politically motivated.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's undeniably the case. Land is always political, right? And how you register and divide up land is one of the big questions of any kind of colonial style regime or reform effort. You know, people always try and reform people through reforming land. I mean, I did some research on this in the areas I was particularly looking at during my doctoral research. And again, one thing I found that I think is relevant to this is that the kind of the 1920s Mandate era settlement left all sorts of ambiguities in place, partly because it was too politically sensitive to kind of iron them out at the time. One of the big ones being what legal status does tribal land have, and who should be considered its owner? Is it sort of communally owned? There's this idea of wajaha, face, or is it, or should it be registered by a sheikh on behalf of the kind of the genealogical category he claims to represent, or should it be divided up equally by families or by households? You know, and this was actually done in different ways under the Mandate land registration in the 20s. They were particularly keen to end communal ownership. You know, there was previously, like in Palestine, musha, the system of sort of owning shares in land around a village, and people would own shares in it, which would then be used to kind of distribute to each family a plot to farm every 2 to 5 years normally. So everyone would move around, and you wouldn't own a particular plot of land. You would own a share in communally held land, which would then be assigned to you. And this land generally was officially Miri, so sort of Ottoman state land in a sense, where cultivators could use it, and they had usufructuary rights. They had the rights to what the land could produce, but they didn't. Ultimately, ownership rested with the state. So with the British mandate, sort of one of the key things they sort of foisted onto the emirate was this was a huge program of land survey and registration. You know, the Department for Land and Survey is kind of the oldest branch of government in Jordan in many ways. You know, it's not quite, but you know, it's still in its original mandate era in Luebde, and its importance to the history of Jordan is immense in many ways over the last century. It was the first big thing the mandate did in the 20s. And they wanted to end this largely wanted to end communal ownership. This was a kind of goal. But at the same time, it meant different things in different parts of Jordan. So in the areas I was looking at, the so-called Bedouin villages, kind of southeast of Amman, they didn't want to risk alienating Mithgal al-Fayez and the Bani Sakha, who they relied on military security of the region. And so they left all sorts of ambiguities in place, like allowing sheikhs sometimes to claim huge personal estates for themselves, which the Ottomans had also done at times because it was useful to buy allies. And you kind of got this system of very, very, very mixed, complicated system. And it exists in other places. It exists in the area around Diban as well, to some degree, in the Wala River Valley, in the Wadi Wala, where you have a mixture of kind of people who've registered small-scale farms individually, and people who sort of regard the land as theirs, but it is actually officially owned by a sheikh or a wealthy landowner, and there's various different relationships of rent or sort of, almost quasi-feudalism. And the interesting thing is that the land system didn't really adequately address these questions, and it still hasn't addressed fully the question of tribal land. This is something that still comes up. Various people raised this in the 2018 protests even. But one of the things where it intersects with what we were saying about water is, what is the status of water reserves on these large areas of disputed land? Can the state take water sources and wells without compensating tribal claimants to the land, or tribes which make a kind of a form of traditional claim to a section of land? And then out east, the system was left really, really ambiguous. The British made no effort to register land east of the old Hijaz Railway. And most of that wasn't registered until after the year 2000. And around Azraq, for instance, you have, as you probably know, a huge number of very profitable agribusinesses, large-scale agribusinesses, on land with very unclear title, which they've more or less taken in kind of land grabs by wealthy speculators and investors. And in these areas where even title to the land is unclear, you often get a proliferation of illegal wells being dug. And people were very, very cunning about how they did this. You have people who hid the drill rigs under tents during the day, so that even aerial or satellite imagery wouldn't be able to spot them. You have very, very narrow wellheads where the wellhead is more or less filled in, and there's only a little bit of piping coming out, and it can be tied up to connected up to a pump at night to bring water up. And of course, wherever this happens in the uplands, the surrounding water table goes down, and the official licensed wells, the legal wells, have to kind of match their depth, right? Otherwise they'll go dry. So you're in a kind of race against the the Ministry of Water and Irrigation, well, the WAJ, the Water Authority of Jordan, has got itself sometimes into these kind of races to the bottom to overexploit aquifers, because otherwise illegal agribusinesses are. And yeah, I think it's definitely the case that at times the government has, for reasons we've discussed around social unrest, and also I think it's fair to say, due to issues of kind of political patronage, issues of wasta, not really gone after these issues as strongly as they might have. You know, it's kind of an aberration, really, that the campaign, you know, Hazem and Nasser went after these illegal wells and filled in a lot of them, prosecuted a lot of people, seized a lot of drill rigs which were being used to dig illegal wells. And obviously, I think it's fair to say that, particularly during times of unrest, you know, the Ministry of the Interior thinks very carefully before deciding to disrupt agriculture in an area where it relies on, you know, non-registered, non-licensed wells. But we're not talking about things that normal farmers can do, right? I mean, it costs upwards of 50,000 dinars to sink a well, more for a very deep one. And then you have an enormous energy cost to do so. We're talking really about large landholders, normally, often with political connections to give them some kind of cover, and often using firms which exist in a kind of grey area. They do some illegal work like this, but they also might be respectable construction engineering companies, plumbers. And there's various points of connection which I'm interested in exploring in further research between these kind of the official and the unofficial networks, right? One thing that seems to come up a lot is the importance of, you know, the haras, the building janitors, who often know how to get water on the cheap and kind of can connect people up to these tanker systems, and those and tanker drivers in turn, some of them at least, will know wells where they can get water on the cheap and can offer people a discount if they're willing to forego any kind of documentary proof of where the water came from, you know, these kind of practices. So that's how it connects up. I think that's one of the things I'm interested in the connection between the land system and the history of the land system and kind of the water, Jordan's kind of water crisis.
Of course. What do you think about the problem of desalination dams and DC water projects? Did you deal with the DC water project?
I did. Mainly, it's not my main focus, but I think it is a really interesting case. And again, it's one that gets so much. There's so many different theories and slightly conspiratorial stories about what happened there, how the project got delayed for so long, whether there were powerful vested interests who wanted to oppose it. I mean, yeah, I think it's, you know, DC has been a known resource since the 60s. You know, the project to pump it up to the north, to the capital, is, you know, a much more recent development. And again, it has a water diplomacy element, right, in that it's the groundwater aquifer extends across the border into Saudi, and is affected by what the Saudis do on their part of the border. And although there's a moratorium on building wells within 10 kilometers of the border, there's nothing on overall amounts taken. So Saudi and Jordan, in a sense, are again in a kind of a race to the bottom to exploit the aquifer, right? And one which Jordan will kind of inevitably lose, because, you know, the Saudis have much more money and a much greater area over which to draw water. And you also have some again, a bit like Azraq, you have some various sort of slightly shadowy practices going on around large scale agribusiness and plantations around DC using its water. So, you know, around Mudawara farms, etc. You know, when DC was tapped, it was to provide water for the Aqaba Water Company, which eventually became the Aqaba Man Water Company, and provided water for the whole South now. You know, Jordan went through this kind of quasi process of privatization on its domestic water supply in the 90s under World Bank tutelage. There are 3 regional water companies, one for the north, one for the middle, one for the south. But the degree to which they're in any way private enterprises is very debatable. Basically, they're not. DC has become kind of key to this. I think one other thing that I'm sure you'll have come across, and I think has made a bit of a media splash, is another former water minister, Mundal Haddadin, made a kind of an interesting TV interview this year, where he said that there were thousands of years of water, at least 1,000 years of water in aquifers below Jordan. People massively underestimated this. Geologically, it's really uncertain how much water there is below Jordan. I'm not a geologist, but geologists seem to come up with quite different estimates. But even if, and I think a lot of people felt that Mundal's intervention there was perhaps an unwelcome one, regardless, because it kind of encouraged a lot of people. And this even came up with people I interviewed who would say, "Oh, I heard it on TV. We don't need to worry. There's plenty of water. It's a sort of manufactured crisis, or it's a conspiracy in some way." The problem is, even if this really there really is this huge untapped resource of groundwater, the question is the energy bill of getting it out of the earth and transporting it, right? Particularly if you have to go below a kilometer into the ground. I think it does seem likely, from talking to geologist colleagues, that DC wasn't necessarily the most logical site to go for to pump huge amounts of groundwater up north to the capital. You probably could have carried out more exploration further north and maybe found you could have tapped the aquifer further north and had a slightly lower transportation bill. But then the question is, if you need to go deeper, vertical distance is more significant than horizontal distance in terms of your energy bill. So I guess I don't have enough technical knowledge to come to a kind of to take sides in the various sort of arguments and claims and counterclaims around the DC project. But I follow it with interest. Yeah, definitely.
Of course. Do you want to add something? What are your next plans? Are you planning to continue your studies?
Yeah, so I think the next stage of this is going to be, in fact, I'm publishing an article that's coming out in the next month or so, actually looking at land relations and the way the history of land settlement is affecting, it sort of affects the current water situation, among other things. So that'll be the kind of first output. And then I'll be working on a couple of papers looking at the social side of non-revenue water. And I'll be writing those on alongside my Jordanian research collaborators. And hopefully we'll be looking to publish those over the summer. The sort of follow-up research I want to do, as I kind of hinted at, is two things. Firstly, kind of around agricultural usage and ideas of environmental justice, how to, kind of how are rural areas responding to the water crisis, and how do they sort of articulate their unease about the future and around the sort of stability of their livelihoods. The other thing, as I said, is kind of going after some of these questions of corruption and what effects different beliefs and different definitions of corruption have on the way people regard the water crisis, and how people even sort of how it affects people's decisions around water use. So those are going to be my focuses going forward, and I think I'll hopefully be back in Jordan at some point in 2024 to carry on.
Excellent. Yeah, we can finish here. I wish you all the best with your research. I wish also all the best to this region, because it's affected with not only water scarcity, but the whole region of of the Western Asia, to use more politically correct term, is food dependent. We're talking about a region that imports 70% of food. I mean, we're talking about the Arab world, and the water scarcity and land degradation and food scarcity can radicalize the local population. This is one of the problems.
Absolutely. And with climate change, that will only be more the case.
Yeah.
We should talk about food. We can talk another time. I think the question of food security is a really interesting one. And again, it has complicated social and political intersections. So maybe we'll talk about that sometime as well.
We can talk about that in our next session. I always have different topics that we can tackle. These topics are very specific and maybe not interested to general public, but I don't give a damn what general public thinks about our conversations. They have all kinds of popular podcasts and they can enjoy discussing popular topics.
Well, exactly.
I wish you all the best and we'll keep in touch.
A pleasure to talk as always. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.